So joining us today, we have Larry Whiteside Jr. Larry is a veteran CISO, CSO, CTO, former U.S. Air Force officer, and thought leader in the cybersecurity field. Larry has over 25 years of experience in building and running cybersecurity programs, holding C-level security executive roles in multiple industries, including the Department of Defense, federal government, financial services, healthcare, and critical infrastructure. Larry is a seasoned cybersecurity professional with nearly 30 years experience in cybersecurity and over 25 years of that being in an executive leadership role. Larry is currently the CISO for RegScale, an organization that is working to shift compliance left and free organizations from the paper world of security and compliance. Thank you, Larry, for joining us. Sean Owens joins us from Apt Associates. Sean currently serves as the Global Chief Information Security Officer at Apt Associates with over 20 years in IT and cybersecurity. Sean has worked with numerous federal civilian agencies, including the CDC, AHRQ, ACF, Department of Labor, Department of Energy, Department of Education, and USAID. In addition to helping project teams and companies navigate regulatory requirements, including, you're gonna make me spell out all these acronyms, right? Health Information Portability and Accountability Act, HIPAA, the Federal Information Security Management Act, FISMA, and risk management frameworks such as the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, and the Cybersecurity Framework, CSF. Sean also serves on Apt's Institutional Review Board. And thank you for joining us, Sean. I really appreciate having the global perspective here today. And last but not least, Michael Roytman serves as the Chief Data Scientist for Cisco Secure. Michael is an experienced advisor with a demonstrated history of working in the computer software industry. Michael is also the co-founder of the Dharma platform, which earned him a spot in Forbes 30 Under 30 list in 2017. Michael is skilled in plumbing, security metrics, herding cats, and Ruby. He has strong entrepreneurship professional with a Master's of Science in Operations Research from the Georgia Institute of Technology. Welcome, Michael. Thank you for joining us. So, as I alluded based on my experience, international development and humanitarian work has long treated sensitive health information with less formality than what you see in the US government and other countries or within a country boundaries. But that trend is changing. Beneficiaries have rights and they have expectations around data protection and data privacy. I'm really asking the panel for guidance on how can we address and how should we address and approach security without really clear guidance and expectations?
I can always start, but so the reality is this: it's really simple. Just do what's right. Right? When we think about data, a lot of times we are so focused on meeting a business objective and trying to accomplish a certain goal to enable our business. And that's fine and that's great. But if you think about doing what's right, if that were your data, would you handle it in the way that you plan to enable your business? If that were your sensitive data, if that were your child's data, if that were your parents' data. And so when you put it in that context and make it more personable to you, you will then make better decisions. Right now, understanding that globally, we do not have holistic laws and holistic rules and holistic regulations around dictating how you must do it. So we must make some personal decisions related to how we must do it, just to align to our own personal belief system. And I think for the most part, most people are good people. Most people want to do right if they made it personal.
I'd add to that, I think we've seen an evolution over time, especially work in Africa, where the expectations of privacy have evolved over time. When going back even 12 years or so, we saw a little bit less interest in protecting the rights of beneficiaries in overseas projects. What we're starting to see now is a little bit more interest. There's both interest from the local governments and local authorities. And we're starting to see it also come out through USAID's work and a upswell in the United States for protecting that information.
I think I agree with everything. I have a perspective where I saw this kind of unfold firsthand. I'm not a humanitarian aid person. I was a security practitioner from the beginning. And I got brought into Dharma Platform as one of the founders because of a security concern. And I think what you're hitting is really right, that there is a business objective that usually overshadows security. And in the past 10 years or so, what we've seen is that some of those business objectives are actually aligned with security. So a really concrete example is when we were first deploying Dharma Platform in Erbil, the WHO didn't want sensitive data sent back to a US cloud because some of the people in refugee camps were ISIS operatives. And they didn't want US government information to be scanned, searched for, looked through for those operatives in the refugee camps. So they had a security and privacy concern that was on par with the business objective of helping this refugee population. And all of a sudden, security became something that supported a business objective and started this monumental shift in how we store and handle data, largely because of a nefarious actor to begin with. So there were solutions where we used, mesh networking, didn't send any data back up, kept it all in the camps so that none of the data would be shared, so that those concerns would be alleviated. That's how it got brought into the system. And as Dharma Platform grew, Larry Brilliant, the epidemiologist who cured smallpox or eradicated smallpox, joined our board, and he had a similar concern. In the 70s and 80s, when he was running his programs, there were no privacy concerns. Beneficiaries really didn't have rights. This is why they did mass vaccination campaigns. And so that shift was essentially both the rights of beneficiaries became more recognized, and the rights of beneficiaries were being exploited by people who use data to exploit those rights. So all of a sudden, it became a business objective to have security in the way we collect and store and use data.
So an important thing to catch is the last piece he said, that data being used to exploit. If you think about the world we live in now, we're more connected than ever, right? It's easy for anybody, pretty much anywhere on the planet, to have access to almost any data they want. And so as we gather more data, and we're in this world of data sprawl, and more content is available about each of us, whether we're putting it out there personally through social media or some other platform, or it's being gathered by some service that we utilize, it is being utilized by threat actors to take advantage of us, right? Phishing was not a thing 25, 30 years ago. But now, because there's so much data available about each of us and what's important to us, it's easier to utilize that data to try and take advantage of us in a nefarious way. So with that, it's become ever more important. If you look at the data sets that we as people have on a regular basis, you've got financial data, you've got personal data, you've got health data. Those are probably the three sets of data, right? How many people in here just let their financial data be controlled just by their bank and then never look at it? Raise your hand. Right. Okay. But our personal data and our health data, how many people are taking control of that? Right. So when you start looking at these data sets and the availability of that to be out there somewhere for someone to access, now that we've got these data sets being used against us, we're starting to say, oh, crap, we need to do something. We've got to do something differently.
So it seems that what the panel is talking about really is that ethical obligation outside of there being clear guidance or clear direction. But how should teams operate without the contractual requirements that can actually help? I mean, how can we realistically set expectations, for example, with our contracting officers and with the people that are funding the work? Because taking these measures, we understand there's a moral, ethical responsibility to do so, but it takes resources and it takes money. And how can teams realistically work to manage expectations around security?
I'll start this one because I have the least experience in it.
Sounds great.
We can move along the maturity level. That obligation arises from the fact that some of the people on whom we are collecting data don't have recourse. They don't have a pathway to recognize their own rights or establish them. So when a funder says, let's assess this population, the population itself might not be part of that conversation. Best case scenario, they're participating in it. Worst case scenario, the funder says, we need this data to do X. So when we think about which protections do we want to establish, part of it is future proofing and thinking, let's assume that they had the recourse that essentially we're working so that they will have it in the future. What would they ask for? How would they want their data handled? And in reality, it's not that different than do unto yourself as you do unto others. But another huge part of this is that there is a cost to it. And you're not just doing this out of the goodness of your heart. You're doing this as, do I have the funding? Can I afford this? Does this make sense? Will my operation be sustainable? So part of that conversation is segmenting responsibility. We at Cisco supply all the hardware for the cloud networking switches. And so we have a shared responsibility with Google and Amazon to decide we are responsible for the hardware security. They are responsible for the software that runs on that hardware. Then similarly, if you build an application in Amazon Web Services, they have a shared responsibility clause in that contract as well, where they're responsible for all the software running the operating systems. If you build an application, you're responsible for what's done with that application. And so there's almost a cascade of handing off responsibility that happens in technology. And part of that is that that cascade should also get down to the program management level of stating explicitly, this is my responsibility. Everything else is on this party. And it can't just be an ambiguous party that isn't an actual party. It has to be a transference of risk or responsibility that we established at the beginning.
I'll take a kind of different approach to this for a quick second. A lot of us collect data. We're at DHS2 Symposium, which is about data collection capability. That is our lifeblood. So if we look at this as a little bit of a selfish act, if we don't apply some level of ethical, moral protection, security to this, we are going to be starving ourselves. So we want to collect this information from beneficiaries. We want to be able to provide support to these folks. If we don't protect the information, why would they want to participate in our program? They're going to get hurt by it and get a benefit? That doesn't sound great. I mean, you have some pain with some benefit. That doesn't seem like a great thing here. So I think when we look at this, there's also self-interest here. And I don't mean that in a negative way. But I think as a community, we have to do this all together, because the harm that happens to one of us by a breach, by some loss of confidence in the security and privacy of our systems, results in impact to all of us, because we are all data collectors. So I think this is something, when we look at data privacy, we have to consider the moral obligation that we have to both our community and our beneficiaries to make sure that we are holding all of ourselves to a high standard so that we can continue to provide benefit to those who need it.
So digging in a little deeper around the shared responsibility model, I mean, essentially it's outlining within the realm of security and controls, depending upon the role, there's a variety scale of responsibility. But how can we keep that? How can we make the shared responsibility model actually make people accountable for their responsibility, as opposed to it being used as a way to deflect responsibility in terms of, well, the cloud provider does everything, I have no role, for example, in access control or boundary protection or something like that. How can we better define that so that it doesn't become just a checkbox activity, so to speak?
So Sean and I got into this a little bit as we were walking in. It's contracts, right? At the end of the day, a contract is a legal binding agreement that once signed, both parties, literally you can be sued. There's all sorts of things that can come out of that. You've got to utilize contract vehicles. The challenge becomes this. What is the level of specificity that you want to get to in that contract to hold somebody else accountable to? Because if you get to a level of specificity where you hold them accountable to something specific, it's great. And it becomes very, very, very difficult to manage and utilize that holistically across all of your contracts. So then what most organizations do is they say, well, we won't get super specific. We'll keep it a little broad. But the more broad you make it, the less you have the ability to hold them accountable to something specific. So it's a dance. Like, it is literally a TikTok dance to try and figure out how you do this and what that balance is. And so Sean was talking about, he's doing all of these different contracts. And me coming out of the corporate private sector space, we like it to be one. I like one. If I have to deal with every contract that my organization signs to do a completely separate clause and legal agreement, I will die. Like I almost said kill myself, but I didn't want to say that. But it would be insane. It would be absolutely insane because I would never do anything other than that. So I want to be general, but at the same time, when you're dealing with these types of contracts and you're dealing with the population and the type of people that you're serving, you sometimes have to get to that level of specificity. But your contract vehicles are going to be your mechanism to share that responsibility and to hold each other, right? Because it's a two-way street. When they're signing it, you want to hold them accountable, but there's also some aspect of accountability that they need to be holding on you.
There's we had this conversation during some prep. When it comes to the prime contractor, the person who's actually receiving the funds from the sponsoring organization, to me, that's where the responsibility lies. So regardless of the subcontractors, the responsibility lies with that prime contractor. And we know that when we're doing especially international development, that we have contractors, we want to partner with in-country resources. We want to develop capacity in-country to do this work. Part of that capacity building does include some security and privacy elements. But those subcontractors that you're dealing with internationally, at least in my experience, they don't always have access to the same resources. They don't have access to the same skilled individuals to address these types of issues. So when we look at the responsibilities of the prime, the responsibilities of the organization that knows better, we have to try to put down some guidelines. If we cannot enforce it through contract, which is not always an option, or we have a partner who, no matter what, they just are incapable of meeting those security requirements due to the lack of resources. We as primes, we as those that are in the know, all of you that are in this conference now hearing about security and privacy, and I'm sure you've been interested in the past, we want to start pushing and promulgating those ideas down to those partners to make sure that they have good security in place, good privacy practices in place, starting with principles to guide, and then going into, which I imagine we'll talk about a little bit later, controls, actual down to earth. How do you support privacy and security in a realistic way, operating in the places that sometimes we have to operate, which is you've got to be creative when you're implementing that security control.
Yeah. A contract is a negotiation, and what we're trying to do is make it so repeatable that we can enter into the same contract every time. Part of that is knowing your values, so you can set guidelines that are persistent throughout any country or any contract you're in. So when I think about security, the CIA triad of security is confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And confidentiality is, will you have a data leak? Integrity is, can somebody mess with your data to make it inaccurate? Availability is the data set running? Can you access it? Those are the three types of ways somebody can mess with a data set. And I think if you have that values-based discussion about what are the threats in this context, what's more important to me, a contract is a negotiation. So there's some give and take. For example, if the data set is unavailable for 3 hours, does that fundamentally change your program? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe you're okay with looking at it once a week. And so that is something you can give in the contract. But if there's a data leak, a confidentiality breach, sensitive medical records might leak. And so that is something you're not willing to negotiate on. So ultimately, if you think about what could happen and you think about what's valuable to the program and to the constituency, you can kind of start to figure out what's important to you and set those guidelines at the beginning so that, to your earlier point, you're not writing 50 different contracts, each one of which is different. You've stated your values. Part of your values is, what do you value in security and privacy?
So we want as much consistency as possible. We need to be aware of context. How does this change the conversation in very low resource settings and remote areas? How do we balance that need to be consistent to the standards that we would set in higher resource settings and more metropolitan areas when you're actually out in the field and dealing with really a lot of, I would say, contextually specific hurdles that you have to face? How can we strike that balance?
That's really tough. I was just working with a team not a couple of days ago where they had limited access to cellular service. They also had limited access to power, just electricity. This means that when I come in thinking, okay, I'm responsible for 4,000 nodes on 3,000 people, 4,000 nodes on our network. I have access to electricity. I have reliable access to internet. So I can implement these great fancy controls that we all think is what is security. Well, when you don't have power all the time and you don't have reliable internet access, one location didn't even have a network. They had literally a computer hooked up to a battery that had intermittent cellular service. When we're looking at these types of situations, we need to start thinking both, what do we need to get the job done? We need information. We need people to be able to communicate. We need to be able to share. So how do we start shifting security to the earlier part of the process? How do we start to include security in the design of the protocol that's realistic and contextually aware that you're not going to have power again? So in this one site, we talked about printouts. How do you print out materials? Well, they don't have power. They don't have cellular service. Anybody have a guess their access to ink and toner? Right? So you're going to be transporting ink and toner across, and people are going to be shipping reams of paper. So exactly. So you have to start thinking through, okay, how's this group going to operate? So I got into questions: how many pages are you printing here? How accessible is it to get the toner and the ink for this? So what I'd say to answer the question about how do we start to address this need where we have low resources is we want to start bringing the conversation about security and privacy at the beginning of the project. How do you start to talk about what needs to be done? What are the available technology resources? And then figure out the right way to utilize them. And in some cases, it's paper. And I'll tell you, it's really easy to figure out if you lost a piece of paper because it's not in your hand. Right? You can track that pretty easily. But when it comes to millions of records that are stored in an electronic system, as you said, threat actors can pull that out. We have a loss of availability. We have tampering of that data, that information. So I would say to kind of address it, we need to shift ourselves to the left, not be the afterthought of the project that's already started, but instead, how do we build security into the beginning based upon how they need to operate?
Yeah, so I'll add a little to that, and I agree with that completely. Like building security in at the beginning saves you 20x on cost of building it in after the fact, right? But I'll also add, you use the word in their context, right? So we have to start contextualizing the controls that we need to implement, right? Meaning, you can't implement certain things if the context doesn't match. So to ask an organization, right, where they don't have power all the time, they don't have internet all the time, there's certain controls that just aren't going to apply. And to ask them to implement them, right, means you aren't paying attention to the context of the total situation. So when you are going in, if security has not been built in from the beginning and you don't have that opportunity, it is to look at the context, look at the controls you want, but add the context to the situation to it to figure out which ones are realistic and which ones are not, and build around that.
And controls aren't a thing that exists amorphously out there in the world. They exist as a response to a threat. And so a threat is sometimes, a Russian hacking group or an ISIS hacking group, but a threat is also a lack of power, right? So if you can model those threats when you're starting out the program, some of them will be security threats that you can control with security controls, and some of them will be business objectives or things to watch out for, which you should also include at the beginning and start to model. But if you're having that discussion about, and this is just good business practice too, not just for this kind of setting, but for any setting, what could go wrong? How will we handle it if it goes wrong? If you do that at the beginning, that's a 20x savings versus doing it at the end once it actually goes wrong.
It sounds complicated.
A little bit.
Sounds overwhelming.
Well, it's a discussion, right?
Yeah. Are there frameworks? Are there tools perhaps that you guys are all very well versed in the world of controls, and you can probably rattle off all of the NIST groups and control areas. But to people who don't live and breathe security every day, where do they start? What should they prioritize? What would be the top control areas that, to someone who doesn't have a lot of resources and a lot of experience, where do they start, and where should they even begin early in the process to bring the context into the conversation?
There's going to be debate about this one. It
Yeah.
depends on your view. Well, I can tell you the enterprise view is that something around 60% of intrusions can be stopped by a second factor of authentication, especially in low resource setting where breaching the second factor is probably prohibitively expensive. There's only been 3 two-factor authentication breaches, and they were, Twilio, Uber, and one I cannot name. Then if you have a control like that statistically can prevent a lot of things, you can feel good about a lot of different threat actors. But at the same time, there are some more primitive controls, like, for example, paper backups for availability, that if you know that availability is a value to you, you can implement from the beginning. And then if you look at the threat landscape, there's the Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report, which is the secret services of a lot of governments. Every year they come together and disclose what went wrong, what breaches happened, what was the cause of those breaches. They're public. You can read them. There's executive summaries for nonprofits, for finance, for education. If you look at one of those, you'll see the top causes of breaches, something like hacking, insider use, phishing, malware, ransomware. And depending on the context you're working in, 50% of those might not even apply. No one's going to run ransomware on your one machine that is hooked up to power 50% of the time. There's nothing to earn from that. You don't have budget to pay them. So maybe don't worry about the controls that control ransomware. So thinking through what's likely to happen, what do I care about if it happens? Thinking in the attacker's mindset is actually a good start. And then maybe getting just a general landscape of what has happened in the past and seeing, would this apply to me? Realistically, nothing net new first time in the world is going to happen in one of these settings just because it's not that profitable. And so if you think about it that way, then you want to make sure that you're taking care of the averages. And the averages is something we have a pretty good handle on and have seen historically.
Yeah. Go ahead, Sean.
So I'd pick two families.
Go ahead.
Larry, we'll see where you go. I picked two control families, two control area frameworks. One would be the cybersecurity framework, NIST cybersecurity framework, CSF. One thing is it's open to everybody. So as you're working with in-country staff, you're working with folks in different areas. There is, and I sadly have read most of this material, about 3,000 pages of materials available to understand the control framework. It also allows you to pick through, and multi-factor authentication's on there. Power is on there. And you can go through and custom tailor to make sure it fits your context, your environment that you're working in. That would be my first pick as an actionable item for any team implementing any technology, is to look at that. That's the technology side. We also have to talk about the privacy side. And this is where I go to the, if I get it right, the fair information privacy.
Fair information privacy. Yeah.
The FIPS, they're called FIPS. They're an extension of the privacy controls included in the FISMA framework. It's a great place to start your journey. You can go through those controls, the privacy controls, and you can start to talk about, okay, and I'll tell you just as a preview, they're a little bit like GDPR. So there is an element of tracking it. There's an element of recourse. There's an element of how do you have your data expunged if you don't want it in your system. So going through those two control frameworks, they are lengthy. There's a lot to read, but there's so much backup materials that if you're a 1-person, 10-person shop, you have access to everything that a consultant would also have access to. And so if you're going to start on that journey, I would say look at those two frameworks because they're going to be the easiest place to kick off a journey into addressing real security controls and real privacy controls in a repeatable way, no matter where you are.
Yeah, so I'll agree with you on FIPS, right? I think FIPS is a great place to go for privacy. There's not a whole lot of privacy standards that you can pick to choose from, right? So that's a great one. On the other side, there's a gazillion standards, ISO, NIST 853, NIST CSF, right? But I would choose for small businesses is CIS Top 20. And the reason I say CIS is because it's written in English, right? Not to just downplay the other ones, but the other ones are sometimes written in a language associated with the industry of cyber and technology that can be really confusing to the novice. So you go in and read it and you're like, what are they really asking me to do? So the CIS controls, they took a lot of effort in trying to make these things everyday, plain English that a third grader can read and understand what they're asking you to do, right? But the important part is, and this one's not as long as the NIST CSF, but the important part is always goes back to what Michael said, goes to what Sean said, and I mentioned a little bit, context, right? You don't need multi-factor if that's not an area of concern for you, right? You've got a single PC sitting somewhere where you only have power 40% of the time. Like there's certain things that you just won't have to deal with. So look at the controls of whichever framework you go to, CIS, FIPS, the NIST CSF, and contextualize the controls based on your environment. Look at what are the threats that you realistically are going to likely have to deal with. Because if you start trying to apply controls based on threats that don't impact you, you're going to be wasting your time, resources, and dollars.
So I'd like to actually throw a control family out there that didn't get brought up, and that would be awareness and training. Small businesses can struggle to find good resources, cheap ways to raise the awareness of their staff, and often that can be the weakest link. You can have wonderful controls in place, you can have things written in your contracts, all of this being done by a very small set of people within the organization. What are some resources that can be used to generally raise the awareness of staff when you don't have a whole corporate cybersecurity program and tons of money to throw at internal training?
Yeah, so the federal government, the U.S. federal government has multiple sites that you can go to for free cybersecurity awareness training. It's like, just Google it. I don't know the specific site, but NIST has some. Like, there's tons of that. And I will agree with you, that is the biggest bang for your buck. So we as carbon-based life forms are flawed by nature, and we are also curious by nature. So getting a link that says, hey, you just won $1 million when you're broke, right? So because of that curiosity, because of the nature of it, we have to teach our staff and the people who are going to be working with and implementing and working with the data that we're dealing with. It's important that they understand some just basic good hygiene things. It's the same things. So how many people have kids, right? How many people let their kids go online without telling them anything before they went online? Exactly. Oh, no. So for those who didn't raise their hand right there, right, you wouldn't let your children go online without giving them some understanding of the dangers associated with social media and the technology that they're now putting in their hand. That applies to your employees as well, right? So for the people who are going to be utilizing the systems that you have in your organization, you've got to have those conversations. And there are tons of tools and things that are freely available. You do not have to go buy a security awareness training program. There are tons of things that you can point them to that will teach them and give them some basic understanding.
I'll probably provide a little bit of a kind of a dissenting view. I think it is of course really important to train individuals, but over the years that I've done the awareness programs and done phishing programs, it doesn't really drop that far, and a hacker has to win once, whereas you have to win 100% of the time. What we found to be very effective is to design the protocol, design the data collection activities that account for those risks, account for the human failures, document those, and then when the project starts up, as you bring people onto the project, that you educate them on how they're supposed to do it. Because that's going to essentially allow them to know what is the right way, as opposed to looking for all the dangers, which paranoid people, it's, we love that in security. We love everybody to be paranoid, but at the end of the day, it's kind of disabling. It impacts productivity. So what I would say is that security awareness is very important, is important to control family. But I would say that it goes back to making sure that you're shifted to the left. You're actually part of the protocol design and you're baking it in, and then you educate. You make them aware of the right way to do it so that they can just repeat that over and over, because generally people just like to do a good job.
So he didn't disagree, really.
Not completely, just a little.
I'll give you a little hack for this, which is if you work at an NGO or a nonprofit or a Ministry of Health, reach out to any of the cybersecurity vendors, your CrowdStrikes, your Palo Altos, your Ciscos, your Microsofts, and they will have somebody there that will gladly host a 1-hour training for free. Mostly because they don't make their money off of NGOs, they make their money off of large businesses. Those trainings are a negligence thing. All of those people like to do something actually meaningful and useful, and if an hour of their time is all it takes, they'll absolutely do it. You probably won't have to pay for it. The other thing is, earlier we were talking about early on, before the program starts, you want to have a discussion about threats and context and what could go wrong. That's not a discussion between you and your board of directors or your funders. That's a discussion between everybody who's involved in the program all at once. And the more you bring in people who you might not think benefit from it, that's the security awareness that you're doing. They're aware of what you think could go wrong from day zero. And if they're brought into that conversation, not only are they less likely to succumb to those vulnerabilities, but they also feel more valued and they're more likely to participate.
So let's bring the concept of shift left, which is bringing security earlier in the conversation. A lot of times it manifests in terms of development activities, tools, technologies, but we're talking here in this context, I think, more around just the mindset of considering security early, and the awareness and training aspect of it. And back to the original conversation around what we do is data collection. How can we help make sure that we're having those conversations again as early in the initial scoping to make sure that we even have a need to know to collect some of the data that we collect? My perspective of it, researchers, people that are trying to impact change, they get excited. They think they need to collect all the data. We need all the data, all the data elements, all the data points. I might need that someday. So I better ask that. I need to know that. And how can we actually really drive the conversation around, do you really need to have personally identifiable information in order to achieve the impact that you're trying to achieve? And starting to have those conversations, that's the first part of my question to the group here. And then are there breadcrumbs we can leave so that maybe we're not getting that data now and storing it very conveniently for a threat actor along with the rest of our other data? But if you need it later, you could make those associations. Strategies to make it much more difficult, right? If you are separating the personally identifiable from the protected health, for example, does that make it an easier way? And can we have these conversations earlier, shifting left into the inception of a project?
So this is a tough one. And it's tough because, so as security practitioners, we believe in shifting left. Like, let's talk about security from day zero. When I say day zero, meaning at ideation, when the idea comes to someone's head that we need to do this particular business initiative, security needs to be brought into the room right away. I've got an idea, bing, security. Like, that's how it should be in a perfect Zen world. However, that's not the world we live in. So that being the case, it's hard because we don't generate revenue. And so the business is responsible for revenue generation. We are here to help mitigate risk associated with revenue generation. And so it's hard for us to say, no, don't grab that data. You don't have a need for that data, because in their mind, they're saying we want all the data we can get because we can create a need later. And it's hard. And I don't care, unless you as the security leader are reporting to the CEO and you are a peer to the business leader that's responsible for this particular business initiative, it's hard, even if you have a voice that's heard, to get them to not think about not just the dollars today, but the dollars tomorrow.
So before we turn it out to the crowd for questions, I did want to find our friends at UIO. Austin, is there maybe what are some features that are on the priority list of DHIS2 that are relevant to security that perhaps you could share with the crowd? What are you guys prioritizing?
Sure. Thanks for a great presentation, discussion. On the UIO side, for DHIS2 in general, security has been a big focus for us for the last, at least the last year, 2 years. We've developed some of the processes around vulnerability management and disclosure, more timely releases around patching security vulnerabilities, as well as investigating and discovering those vulnerabilities through more rigorous controls around the release process. And we've also hired some of our first dedicated security personnel. So it's been something that has been a focus for the development team for quite some time, but there wasn't dedicated personnel specifically around security. And that's something that I think probably everyone would agree. That's one of the most important things for implementations as well, is just make sure that you know who is the security person. Like there should be somebody who's thinking about that, and somebody who people know to go to, because if it's just spread out amongst everyone, things get lost. In terms of features and functionality within DHIS2, one of the major focuses right now, and it's particularly associated with the federal government regulations in the US around multi-factor authentication, is improving support for multi-factor authentication in different formats, as well as improving the ability to have more fine-grained authentication mechanisms for integrations with external systems, for programmatic access, and deprecating things like basic authentication for DHIS2, which has been used for a long time and frankly can be easily abused by people that aren't maybe thinking about security. And we get asked these days, what's the easiest way to put my username and password into my JavaScript application so that I can have a public web portal to talk to DHIS2? The easiest way is don't do it, please. But that's the kind of thing where awareness and training is very important, but there are also ways that we can make it more difficult to work around the security controls, because there are a lot of cases where, or usually the case is that it's the weakest link that breaks the bank. So if you don't have, if you make it easy or difficult to implement things securely, then they will be implemented insecurely, and you'll run into issues. I could go into more specific features, but hopefully that gives a little bit of an overview.
Thank you, Austin. Did anybody want to respond to what Austin said?
I just want to say thank you for the Log4j response. It made my life a lot easier to get a very prompt response for understanding the impact of Log4j to DHIS2 software. So thank you very much for that.